What's going on, guys? It's Bromley, and today I want to get back into programming discussion just a little bit. I know that I've broken off into some other topics, and I'll revisit those here and there, but for now, I want to go back to a little bit of programming. It's been a while since I've talked about programming a little bit, and with all the contests that we have getting ready for, my brain is in peak mode because I'm constantly having to funnel everybody's training into these set peaks, and it's forced me to really be kind of fluid and intuitive with how we prepare athletes to perform at their absolute best. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about kind of exactly what is going on during a peak, how we organize that, what principles we focus on, some of the different ways to do it. And even if you don't compete, this is important because it gives you a handle on how general training should go. So I'm going to cover a little bit about kind of how normal training organization happens and how we move between different variables to predictably get a good result. So when it comes to a peak, we're talking about preparing you to perform. So a couple things have to be true. Now I summarize this, I call it the SRN model. It's nothing new, but it's how I organize these thoughts kind of intuitively, where S is specificity, R is recovery, N is novelty. So, all right, so SRN, if we're talking about specificity as the first variable, this has to change over time. And that's true of any training organization, regardless of whether you're talking specifically about a peak or not. So specificity, we're talking about movements and we're talking about thresholds. Now with movements, the idea basically goes that the further are you out, you're out from a meet. So if we say, very far away, you can call it, a volume or a hypertrophy or a introductory phase, whatever you want to call it. They go by different names. And then we're getting into contest prep or your peak, your taper. This is the area where, we could say this is, 6 weeks and 6 weeks. It could be different times. It could be 12 weeks with, 4, 5, 6 weeks of actual contest prep. So the idea is that we start very broad and we're covering a lot of different things. We're doing a lot of different movements, very non-specific. The threshold is very non-specific. The idea here is that we are trying to build a wider base, right? So, I'm going to write this until you guys are sick of seeing it, but the wider our base is, the higher our potential peak goes. And contest prep is chasing that peak. A wider base means more mass, more skill, fewer weak points. It means rounding out things you sucked at. It's going to make you more efficient. It's going to give you more raw materials with which to dial in those more specific movements so that by the time you start incorporating in more specific activities, now we're very narrow. We're only doing a few things. Now our threshold is going to be very razor thin. We're just specifically focusing on the threshold that we're going to test. So if you're doing a strongman meet and there's, let's say, a high rep car deadlift and you know that the winner is going to get 15 or 20 reps, you're not going to be hitting 1 rep maxes at this point. You're going to be training specifically to the contest. So this kind of general off season period, that's where you do all the broad stuff. This general contest peak, the taper, this is where everything gets very specific. If you're a power lifter, what are you going to do? You're going to do, let's say, squat, bench, deadlift, right? But you're going to do all your variations. You're going to do isolation. You're going to do machines. You're going to do dumbbells. You're going to do variations. You might do something that looks like a bodybuilding split. You're going to do, 15s. Well, some of you will. A lot of you will ignore that like your life depends on it. 15s, 12s, 10s, 8s, and so on. And then as you get over here, you're really just squat, bench, deadlift, and you're really, 3 reps and under. That's kind of what you're at. Most of your work is going to be super strength specific, 85 to 100%, and that's going to be what the last few weeks of training looks like, and that's how you train the most specifically. All the broad stuff takes a long time to grow. It takes a long time to transfer over to what you want it to. So that transition, you sort out on a long enough time frame that you can give yourself the opportunity to build those qualities and then focus on them specifically. 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out from a meet, whatever growth you might get from, sets of 10 on dumbbell tricep extensions, you don't have enough time to get substantial enough growth for that to carry over specifically to your bench press. That is a broader quality. When you're brand new, when you've never lifted a weight, yes, that might make a dent. But as you get more specialized, you need more specialized training to push you forward. And that is where this dynamic comes from. Remember, base and peak. We're always starting. And this is kind of an easy way to conceptualize how all training organization happens. I mean, there's periodization, which talks about training in different periods, which is what this is. There's non-linear periodization, or in a sense, there's types of training that are non-periodized. Concurrent training isn't really periodized, but you still have to take into account specificity, and you will still make moves closer to your contest to eliminate the things that don't directly carry over. So that's specificity. Wow, I butchered this. Recovery. I can't talk and write at the same time. Okay, so recovery is another key aspect that goes into a peak. So we just had a contest where we had 3 women. We had my wife, and then Emily Elliott and Gabby Cidio, and they had this run of events. They had an overhead, they had a deadlift, they had a truck pull, they had stones, and they had yoke. Now, in the last 5 weeks of training, everything was very razor thin, narrow, right? Before that, they were doing a lot more work. It was a lot more broad, different training thresholds. So we had this kind of tapering down, this focusing that happened right around that cutoff. They all showed up PRs across. I mean, Laura hit a 375. I'm going to brag about this forever. She had a 375 for 5. She's never pulled anything over 350. And that means even into her training, we don't do maxing out. I don't have, the closer you get to a meet, it's common, especially in strongman, if there's a set weight, you're not sure you can do it. You spend all these weeks maxing out, trying to test, trying to prove to yourself you can get it. And that's dumb. All you can do is get yourself as strong as you possibly can. So we tapered her up towards this goal, and she just grew like a weed. Now, part of the aspect was recovery, because when you're doing all this work, fatigue gets sky high. Fatigue gets very high. There's a saying, if any of you follow his radel, fatigue masks fitness. That means that if you're training hard enough to grow and consistently enough to grow, to test yourself, to disrupt homeostasis, that ultimately means that you are going to accrue fatigue. If fatigue is not accrued, that means that you're not training very hard. You're not going to be peaked off season. A peak is a different thing. It's temporary. That's probably the most important part of this that you can understand. In training, you can manipulate fatigue to get a little more recovery, but that's not a true peak. A true peak is where fatigue drops. It goes through the floor. So the amount of volume and work you're doing drops, which means recovery goes way high. So at this one singular day where you have to do all these things, your recovery is absolutely through the roof, but you're not detrained, and that's a balancing act you have to do. So usually what I'll do is, if I have the contest week, and then I'm 1 week out, 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out, the contest week, it's on a Saturday, so that full week is nothing. I mean, there might be a very light feeder day where we're doing 65% for a couple sets of 5. We'll do some pull downs just to get blood moving and keep you from going crazy. The week before, if you're brand new, you can do your 100% run through the week before. And I actually like to cut that off midweek. So that's something like 9-10 days out. But actually, typically what we do is 80% run throughs for our more advanced lifters. And this is anybody who's been training for a while who's moderately competitive. And then for them, they'll actually do their 100% week the day before. And then this is our last week, 3 weeks out with any amount of volume. So, just throwing a number out there, we might do, I don't know, if we're doing 4 triples or something, the 100% week is 1 to 2 sets. The 80% week is 1 to 2 sets at a reduced load. Then we deload. So all the while volume is climbing down, the amount of work you're doing is climbing down, which means recovery goes sky high and you peak right at the contest when you're supposed to. Now, if you keep that trend up, you can't just keep recovering, you'll detrain. And that's an important thing to remember. So you have to time it. And then after we do this, then, we clear out for a week or 2, and then we'll start another off-season block. So the last one was novelty. Now, this is a general training principle. Novelty works with specificity and recovery. So the fact that you are getting more recovered That's a novel stressor to your body. The fact that you are training more specific, that's a novel stressor to your body. I talk about novelty really in terms of kind of non-contest specific ebbing and flowing, where as you're going back and forth between base and peak phases, that it's the newness of these stresses that causes growth, because diminished returns set in. If you're doing the same stress and you're getting a certain increment of growth, eventually that increment of growth whittles down to nothing. And you can think about this with any drug, any other stimulus. Caffeine is a perfect way to visualize this. If you're not used to coffee, you drink coffee, it'll light you up for a while. But then eventually a cup of coffee doesn't do anything. And then you're going on to hard stuff. You're going on to the 300 milligram rock stars. And eventually you're going on to the 300 milligram rock stars, and you have to do 2, then 3, then I've known guys that have done 10 in a day. Now that's not good. That's not healthy. It's easier just to rotate stimulus. You can rotate stimulants when it comes to like something like caffeine. That's actually an option. Or you can just take a deload. So if you do a 1 to 3 week deload of caffeine, what you find is that when you start back up, you get that big stimulus. You're a cheap date again. So we do the same thing in training. So this novelty is what keeps us going. Specifically for the context of a peak, it is the fact that fatigue is so low and that you're able to actually work into these specific thresholds so fresh and so recovered. That kind of represents a novel stimulus. And I do think that that's really responsible for giving you a big boost in performance, is that now you're handling these intensities you've never handled before with more coordination and know-how of the movements than you've ever had before. And that is, again, something that creates a big boost in performance. So that's really what goes into the peak. It is more specific work, it's skill, it's coordination, it's practicing how you play, it's the energy systems you're using. And I can't stress this enough. If you're a power lifter, remember, the energy system you're using, you're not going to want to go over 3 reps in the weeks before a meet. Doing sets of 10, 15, 20 for you bodybuilding guys, that's not going to do anything for you that close to a meet. You have to train specific. If you're a soccer player, you're not going to go do an Ironman the week before. You might say, oh, it's great for conditioning. Yeah, but it's not soccer specific. If you're an MMA fighter, you're not going to pull a max deadlift 2 days before a fight. That's not going to do anything for you. You're going to practice handwork and cadence and working the tempo of the rounds. You're going to do things that are specific to the fight. So this is huge. For strongman, it gets tricky because we're talking about a range, and you have to know which range exists for each event. You might have a deadlift for 10 plus reps. You might have an overhead press for a max single. You might have a long medley like I'm getting ready for that has you go a minute 30, which sucks. You might have a short fast one that is just a foot race. It's over in 15 seconds. And these all represent different thresholds. So you have to plan them out and make sure that each day is orchestrated to that specific event and that specific threshold. And again, we're talking anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks is probably a good range when it comes to peaking, when it comes to planning out your peak. So these are the big ones I focus on. Now, how this corresponds to training in general, I talked about periodization. Periodization just refers to a training organization that works things in periods. So you see periodization reflected a lot of different ways. Linear is kind of the meathead baboon version of periodization. When we first got wind of what the Soviets were doing, we tried to adapt it, and it came out cartoonishly simple. That's not to say it doesn't work or doesn't have validity, but you're talking about doing so many weeks of 10s, then 8s, then 6s, then 4s, then 2s, and down to your contest singles. There's a lot of different ways to structure this. There's a lot of different twists people do. This can work. This is similar to what Ed Cohen did. And the thing is everything you do, and Cohen said it best, you have to make it work. If you're going to plan something like this, you have to tweak it to figure out what the appropriate time frame is for you to spend in each one. Where do you get carryover from 10s into 8s? Where can you potentially spend too much time in 10s where you start making endurance specific gains that don't have anything to do with your actual strength? So that might vary. 2 weeks at each phase might be perfect for some people. Some might need less time in one and a lot more time in another, or vice versa. Now, this also coincides with, again, volume changing. The real simple ones, you might see 5 sets, and then it might go to 4 sets, and then it might go to 3 sets, all the way down to just a couple. And again, the idea is volume over time smoothly drops, and intensity over time smoothly increases. And doesn't that look pretty on paper? Now, again, this works because there is some training organization to it, and it does abide by what we just talked about with changes in volume, novel changes in the threshold, becoming more specific over time. Recovery gets higher as the weights get heavier. So that's a factor. But a lot of especially the Soviet coaches, Shaiko himself had a passage that I really liked about the fact that smooth transition is useless because that's not how the human body adapts. And it was a pretty shrewd analysis of why this is unnecessary. And the Soviets actually, they decoupled volume and intensity. They would do this kind of sporadic wavy thing, and you would have to pull the magnifying glass out to look way back from the 30,000 foot view, and you would see, it would do stuff here, but volume would then drop more aggressively, and you would get these punctuated periods. So it's still periodization. You were still making the changes you needed to make. So shifting back and forth between these principles gives you a very predictable way of planning periods of fatigue and base building that fix weaknesses and round you out and ultimately widen that base out. Again, that wider base. That base comes out wide, your potential for this peak grows automatically. Now, you might find that you widen this base out, and if you do this intermittent test, you might find that you're really not any higher. But when I say it raises your peak, that's your potential. So once you start doing things that specifically chase that peak, once you start practicing, again, coordination with the same movements, you might switch to something high frequency with the same lifts. Once you start working in that specific threshold, once you start working with increased recovery, and everything becomes oriented towards a singular performance, you will be absolutely blown away at how fast things grow. And again, that applies to if you're peaking for a meet or if you're just running back and forth between base and peak phases. It works the same. The only difference is in a peak phase, you're getting specificity, you're getting a little more recovery, but not as much as when you peak. When you peak, you're getting complete recovery. If this is still just a broad training phase, you don't need infinite recovery here. And you're getting novelty. And these phases represent changes back and forth between those three things. And if you are abiding by that, if every 6 weeks or so you're making these changes, or when something's getting stale and you're like, I've been doing high volume for a while and it's getting stale, well, switch to a peak phase where the volume goes down. See what happens. If you've been doing, thousands of exercises and you saw some good gains from that, but things are getting stale, switch to just a few exercises. Spend some time dedicated to that and see what that does. That's really just what training is. And all training organization, no matter what type of periodization you're talking about, is going to do something to address that. It's going to address the threshold. It's going to address the movement selection. It's going to address recovery. And this whole SRN model is going to determine how well you do. So that's basically where my head has been at for the last couple of months as we prepare for these meets. I'm getting ready for Clash on the Coast. There are 11 damn events, and a lot of them are medleys, which have multiple components. So getting everything straightened out has been a chore. But being good at this, having the experience that I have, is ultimately what gives me an edge, because I know there's a lot of guys who aren't able to juggle those and peak appropriately for all of them at once. So that's really what I'm leaning on when it comes to my success, hopeful success in this show. So thanks for watching, guys. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the comment box. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.